I want to welcome everyone here today. It's a real honor and pleasure for me to be here with Robbie Jones. I'm E.J. Dionne. I'm a senior fellow in governance studies here at Brookings, and my colleague Bill Galston and I are delighted, truly, to welcome our friend Robbie Jones to talk about his important new book, The End of White Christian America. Everyone who has not read it should read Sam Tannenhouse's extraordinary review of a whole series of books on populism and new developments in politics, and he singles out Robbie's as the best. I think it's a fair reading of Sam's review, that it's the best of the lot and the one you really need to read this year to understand the election. Robbie is going to offer a brief presentation of the themes and trends outlined in the book. We've done this before, as some of you know. PRI, Robbie's polling organization, and Brookings have collaborated on a whole series of polls going back 6 years. And the initial seed of this book was in a chart Robbie gave us one day that was so striking that it was worthy of a whole book, and you are going to hear that today. Robbie has all manner of degrees in both, he's the CEO of PRI. He got a PhD in religion from Emory and MDiv from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And the New York Times review, by the way, said it was quite possibly the most illuminating text of this election year. The other thing I want to commend Robbie for before he comes up is it's a very stark title. Robbie writes with extraordinary fairness about white Christian America. This is not a partisan book. It's not an attack book. It's a book that describes what's happening in our country, and it sheds enormous light on what is happening in this presidential campaign and in many other aspects of social life. And I will close simply by saying, for those of you, again, who've come to our events before, Robbie Jones without an extraordinary PowerPoint is like a baseball game that David Ortiz plays in and doesn't hit a home run. Fortunately, Robbie will be doing one of his extraordinary PowerPoints, and I am sure that you will learn as much from it today as we have over many years. It's a real pleasure and honor to introduce my friend Robbie Jones.
Well, thank you to E.J. And for that extraordinary introduction. Thank all of you for being here. I want to say a couple of thank yous. First to E.J. Dionne and Bill Galston for hosting this today, and the entire Brookings team here. And I'll say when we get started, it'll probably be obvious, but many of the polling questions that were in the surveys actually began as conversations between our team at PRI and the Brookings Governance Studies team, actually in the conference room just down the way here. So it's nice to see it come full circle, really, to from an idea that we were wrestling with over a conference table into a survey and now into a book. So thank you for that. I also need to thank Simon & Schuster, who's done a fantastic job on getting the book out there and publishing the book, and also to the entire PRI team who worked tirelessly on a whole range of surveys across the last 7 years that the book draws on. So thank you to everyone here. So I will start with just a little riff on this picture here. So some of you probably have the initial reaction is this looks kind of Norman Rockwell-ish, right? The sort of Freedom from Want piece. This actually is from a Christian Coalition of America email that I got right after Barack Obama's inauguration in 2012. And what was striking about it is that it was sort of lamenting the state of the country that was in. So this email had this photo on the top. It had a caption under it that said, "Thanksgiving 1942, Pennsylvania," was the caption on it. And then there was this text under it that said this in the email. "We will soon be celebrating the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving, and God has still not withheld his blessings upon this nation, although we now richly deserve such condemnation. We have a lot to give thanks for, but we also need to pray to our Heavenly Father and ask him to protect us from those enemies outside and within who want to see America destroyed." right? So this is 3 weeks after the election, sort of right, it's actually 3 weeks after the election, in between the election and the inauguration in 2012 of President Barack Obama. And so what's clear here is that there's a very clear intentional vision, right, of what America is supposed to look like, right? It looks like this white Protestant family at prayer in Pennsylvania in 1942. I was struck by this. I saved it immediately because I just realized like this is a real commentary on a very different vision of America. And what I want to, before I jump into too many numbers here, I want to just say what I mean by white Christian America, just lest I'm misunderstood. I sort of use this term as a metaphor in the book, and it really is talking about the cultural and political edifice that's built primarily, not exclusively, but primarily by white Protestant Christians. And it was this edifice that really set the tone for our national conversations and shaped American ideals for most of the country's life. One great quote that was actually from a book about the Christian Century, which was the flagship magazine for the mainline Protestant world, said this, that in the sort of middle of the 20th century, if you were in charge of something big and important, chances were you were a white Protestant, right? And that was sort of true in the middle of the 20th century. So I kind of use this to talk about not just demographics, but really an entire cultural and institutional world that was built by white Protestants across the course of the nation's history. So I want to say a little bit about this, and E.J., I promise I'm going to get to some numbers here in a second, but I'm actually going to start with some buildings. One of the things that I also realize, if you think about the history of the country, and the way that America's city skylines have changed over time. Like if you think about really up until the 20th century, if you were to look out on most major cities, the things that you would see across the silhouette at sunset were steeples, right? They weren't skyscrapers, they were steeples. And if you think about the way that shapes people's minds, if you just walk around everyday life and as you scan the horizon, what you're really seeing are church steeples. That sort of imprints a kind of power and kind of cultural dominance in your mind. This little still is taken actually from a pretty remarkable video that was put together for One World Trade Center when it went up. And what they have, if any of you have been to visit, there's a floor-to-ceiling panel in the elevator. And as you go up, it's really ingenious that they have a time-lapse shot of Lower Manhattan that goes from like the 1600s all the way up to the present. So the higher you go in the elevator, the further the timeline goes, and you start seeing first the Dutch settlers. Well, actually, first it's like water and ducks, and then you see like the first Dutch settlers coming around, and you see the little buildings popping up in Lower Manhattan. This is 1795, and you'll see the biggest thing there by far is, I don't know if anyone can probably name this, New York, Lower Manhattan, big steeple. Trinity, yes, Trinity Chapel, right? Dominated the New York skyline all the way, really almost up until the 20th century. And this was kind of a mark. And most American cities, you could do this exact same experiment with, and you would see this similar thing. This, of course, is what Lower Manhattan looks like today. Now, Trinity Chapel has not been torn down. It's still in there somewhere, but it's not something you can really see from the shoreline. But that's a really different cultural place to be, that our skylines are now dominated by steeples to commerce, right, and not to kind of religious institutions. A couple of other buildings that may help kind of set up the story here. The one on the left, I'm guessing people may recognize, United Methodist Building, right, on Capitol Hill, here in Washington, D.C. This building was built in 1924. If you haven't been there, it sits basically adjacent to the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol, right? So if you look out one side, you see the Capitol. You look out the other side, beautiful view of the U.S. Supreme Court. When this building was built, it was built by a single mainline Protestant denomination, the United Methodist Church, which at the time was by far the largest denomination in the country. And on the fundraising appeals for that building, the way they described this building is that it was going to be a sentinel for Protestant Christian witness and social reform in the nation's capital, right? So this kind of militaristic, kind of on guard, positive influence there. They actually sort of built apartments into it so that at the time there was a shortage of office space on Capitol Hill, so that people from Congress might even book rooms. They would rub shoulders with people in power during the day. So it was a very powerful statement by a single denomination. In fact, it made the other mainline Protestant denominations quite uncomfortable that the Methodists themselves had planted this single denominational building right there on Capitol Hill. This other building on your right, you may not recognize as well, but it's in New York City. Some of you will. This building is affectionately sometimes called the God Box, right? In New York City. This is the Interchurch Center. It was built in 1960 at sort of the height of the National Council of Churches power and the kind of mainline Protestant power. So I kind of think of these things as kind of two waves of kind of mainline Protestant power kind of ensconcing themselves and manifesting itself in these like very powerful edifices. And if you go in, they have like marble, floorways in the lobby. I mean, they're very, structurally impressive buildings. What's also interesting about these buildings is that neither one of them, through the course of history, had actually quite realized the original vision of their founders, right? That they have sort of changed over time. And one thing that both of these have in common now is that they actually host quite a number of interfaith kinds of organizations, social service organizations. It's a real mix of organizations in them. This one on the right, when it was founded, President Eisenhower laid the cornerstone for this building. He laid the cornerstone and cemented a rock from Corinth, kind of referencing some New Testament passages and the kind of cornerstone of this building. There were tens of thousands of people that turned out for the dedication of this building. It was a who's who of clergy in America. It was written up everywhere. And really an amazing thing. It was funded by John D. Rockefeller Jr., who provided the site and the limestone cladding of the building as well. So what's interesting about these buildings, though, again, is that they had these kind of, this one was called actually the closest thing to a Protestant Vatican the world will ever see when it was sort of founded. But these buildings actually never quite realized that kind of power and influence, and certainly don't express that today. They've had to kind of change their mission as things have changed. One more, lest I sort of pick on the mainliners too much. Anyone recognize this? Crystal Cathedral, right, out in California, Schuler's ministry. This building, when it was originally built, had 10,000 individual panes of glass. It was called the most important building since the construction of the Cathedral of Notre Dame by the New York Times when it was first built. Very impressive structure. Thousands and thousands of people. It had, you can't quite see it here, but there was actually a window that would open so that Schuler at the beginning had people in the parking lots that he would preach to, as well as inside the building. He had a button on the pulpit that he could push and open a door, and he could go out on a platform and talk to people in the parking lots. But it was massive, massive ministry. Again, by the 21st century, first part of the 21st century, this building, the Schuler ministry, went bankrupt. And this building now, again, if you think about the purpose of the building as kind of being this kind of expression of evangelical power, this building now is a multi-ethnic Catholic parish in LA County, right? So another kind of indication of real demographic and cultural change in the country. So with that kind of set up, let me kind of talk about a couple of numbers. If there were one chart I could show you, I'm sorry to say I'm going to show you a few more than one, but if there were just one that I was going to show you, it would be this one. And this is kind of two different lines. One that sort of shows the kind of demographic decline of white Christians in the country, and also the kind of attitudes about same-sex marriage. And then this little shaded part, which it doesn't come out to be so shaded, but between 2008 and 2015 is the Obama presidency here. So let me just kind of show you first. Here's the trend line for the percentage of white Christians in the country. Now, this is all white Christians, so this is Catholics, Orthodox, white non-Hispanic Christians in the country. So one of the astonishing things that I realized in sort of writing the book is that we really had passed a real tipping point that not a lot of attention had been paid to, and that is that at the beginning of Barack Obama's presidency and when he was running for president, the country was 54% white and Christian. Our numbers at the end of last year are 45%. End of 2014, it was 47%. End of 2015, it was 45%. So that's one kind of pretty dramatic change just during the last 8 years in the country. At the same time, if you just as a kind of proxy for cultural change in the country, are shifting attitudes on same-sex marriage, right? So if you look at those attitudes, this is what they look like, again, during the same period. So if you go back to 2008, only about 4 in 10 Americans supported the legality of same-sex marriage. Today, that number is 53%. So big shift just in a small amount of time. And so if you think about just these two things, I think it sets the table well for understanding the kind of anxiety that I think we are seeing from many quarters of the white Christian world, particularly among conservative white Christians for whom same-sex marriage was a very important issue. They were all in opposing this issue, and sort of not only lost in the court of public opinion, but of course in 2015 they lost in the Supreme Court as well. And I think that has set off a real set of reactions in the country. Just to kind of take a look at this in one big pie chart. So this is the end of 2014. 47% white Christian. The other piece of this puzzle that I'll unpack in a minute is, of course, that 22% number, more than 1 in 5 Americans religiously unaffiliated. And those have overwhelmingly come from the ranks of white Christians, right? They have become religiously unaffiliated in the country. Yes. Yes, when I'm using the term white Christian, this includes all white Christians, so Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, anyone who's white and non-Hispanic. In a second, I'm going to telescope down just to Protestants, but for right now, we're looking at all white Christians together, which I think is even more remarkable, right? That you put all white Christians together, and you're still at less than a majority of the country. The other striking thing, EJ mentioned, this is the setup to the chart that EJ mentioned here. The other striking thing that we saw is you can see just in the generational breaks of people who are, the people who are alive today, the stark differences and the way that things have shifted just among the American population that is living today. So take a look at this. This is the percentage of white Christians in each living generation today. So if we look at seniors, 65 years in age or older, 2/3 of seniors identify as white, non-Hispanic Christians. You take that number down to the youngest group, 18 to 29-year-olds today, that number is only 29%. So and it's linear. You could take a ruler and draw a line right through these generational breaks. So it's very, very steady over time. And if you kind of look at it, you can sort of see what's going on here. That the biggest thing going on is that there are far more religiously unaffiliated Americans in that younger group. Almost, in fact, more than 1/3 of younger people are religiously unaffiliated today, and only 1 in 10 seniors were religiously unaffiliated. So this is part of the big sea change going on in the country here. The other thing you can see is that among seniors, the number who were non-white Christians is only 15%, right? And among really anyone under 50, it's double. It's double that. So there's more than double non-white Christians. So it's a combination of disaffiliation and growth among non-white Christians as well in the country. So what does this look like if that's all white Christians? If we kind of look at white Protestants, right, the group that I think has been the most powerful expression, if you think about the U.S. as a waspy nation, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, that kind of stereotype, what does it look like if we just narrow it down to white Protestants? Well, the story is pretty clear. If you just look at, this is an area chart from 1974 to 2014. So this is basically 40 years of data on white Protestants. And as you can see, back in the 70s, and really even through the early 90s, the U.S. maintained a kind of, and it's maybe helpful that it runs right on that vertical grid line in the middle of the presentation. That last little point, I did that on purpose, where that little peak is there, is 1993. That was the last year that the country was a majority white and Protestant. All right, and so ever since then we've been on a pretty steady slide. We're down in the mid-30s over here by the time we get to 2014. So the decline of Protestants in the country really is almost entirely due, as you can see, if I add in. So here are African American Protestants, those other race Protestants, and then Latino Protestants. If I add in those layers on top of this, what you see is that the decline is really almost entirely well, it is entirely really due to white Protestant decline. African Americans, that green ribbon there, have basically maintained their proportion of the population over time. And then Protestants who are other race or Latino, as you can see, have actually been growing. So really the sort of slide in the number of Protestants in the country is entirely due to this kind of white Protestant decline. And there's been this kind of mythology, I think, are kind of talking points among Protestants. One of the things that the book does, it unpacks this kind of battle between, or this kind of sibling rivalry is maybe a better way to put it, between the white mainline Protestant world and the white evangelical world. So all along, these two groups, these two expressions of Protestantism they've been creating competing institutions, the National Council of Churches on the one hand, the National Association of Evangelicals on the other, the Christian Century magazine on the one hand, and Christianity Today on the other. There's always these kind of pairings of responses one to the other. And up until the last 10 years, there has been this kind of talking point among evangelicals that it's just the mainline churches that have been declining, and conservative churches have been sort of hanging on or even growing to their, and sort of linking this to theology, that liberal theology was the kind of cause of mainline decline. And so, you can see why that talking point was here. If I just put up, so this is white mainline Protestants over time from the late 80s to 2014, clearly decline over time. That you can see here. But, if I put in the white evangelical Protestant line, it's certainly flatter, but it still goes from 21 to 18 just over the last 8 years. And it may not seem a lot, but this data set actually has 80,000 people each year. So we can know with a lot of precision that just a slippage of 3 points is actually significant here. And less this kind of, and I should also say that in our 2015 data, it goes one more point to 17, right? So the evangelical number kind of goes down one more number. And less, you sort of think I'm making too much of this. If we look at, there's a lot of other internal indicators from the aging of evangelicals. Their average age now rivals the average age has been creeping up and is the average age of mainline Protestants. And this data here is actually from Southern Baptists themselves. So the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest denomination in the country and by far the largest white evangelical organization, has now posted 9 straight years of membership losses. And this data actually comes from Lifeway Research, their own organization that tracks these things. Here is the declining growth rate among Southern Baptists from 1950 to the present. And you can see that sort of up until really about 10 years ago, they were sort of either stagnating or in like 1%, still in growth mode. But really over the last 10 years, the growth rate has entered into negative territory. And there's actually one more data point on the end of that goes the same direction. So what does this mean for politics? I'm going to kind of take it into the voter realm a little bit. Basically, I'll say just a little bit, we can talk about this some more, but if we look at the national election polls and we kind of chart, again, I'm coming back to all white Christians together here, so this is Catholics, Protestants, everyone put together, and we look at the percentage of white Christians in the electorate, we can see a very similar pattern, although it's delayed, right? So that even though if we look at 2012, 2014, right now, we're now 47% at 2014 white Christians in the general population, but about 57% in the electorate, right? That's because of higher turnout rates among whites is the reason why we get this higher turnout rate. So basically what we see is that in the electorate, we see the same pattern, but a kind of delay in its manifestation over time. And then we also see this interesting little kick in the midterm elections. There's always a little bit of a holdover, right? So even though the trends in the general population are fairly steady, there's basically a holdover each midterm, mostly because of, again, that whites turn out at much higher rates in midterms even than they turn out in the general election. So that kind of gives, in some ways, a little bit of a time machine effect to the midterm elections, where they basically the electorate looks a lot like it did in the general election the year before, and then we see a bump down the following year. But as you can see this, if current trends continue, by 2024, just a couple of election cycles away, that'll be the first election where we have a minority of white Christians actually in the electorate, as it kind of follows the trend line down, so barring some other foreseen event. So what does this mean for the parties? One of the interesting things that the data shows, again, this is national exit poll data. If we look at Democratic presidential candidates, one of the things, and this is a chart of each presidential election year, how reliant the Democratic presidential candidate has been on white Christian votes, right? So go back to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's coalition was 60% white and Christian. We look down at Barack Obama's 2012 reelection, it was only 37% white and Christian. So the Democratic Party and their candidates have been kind of following these trends in the American electorate, becoming less and less reliant on white Christian voters as the demographics change. But look at the Republican line. So here's the Republican line. So we go back to 1992, 86% reliance on white Christian voters. And even 2012, it hasn't changed that much. Still about 8 and 10. Romney was relying, his coalition was about 8 and 10 white Christian voters. So we kind of see this, if the gap between the parties was only 26% in 1992, the gap has become 43 percentage points in 2012 here between the two parties and their reliance on white Christian voters. So this is a very different kind of campaign strategies here. Here is, again, this kind of same layout that I had before, similar chart. This is among voters, though, and not among the general population, but the story is basically the same. White Christian voters in the electorate here broken out by generation. And then I'll put the Obama coalition and the Romney coalition up here so you can kind of see it. This is the chart EJ was talking about that sort of launched sort of the idea for the book. So what we basically see is that the Obama's coalition in 2012 looked about like 30-year-old America, right? If we break it down into its kind of racial and religious demographics and kind of place it where it would fit on the chart. And if we look at Romney's coalition, though, it looks about like 70-year-old America, right? And so this is a real challenge, I think, for the Republican Party going forward with these kinds of changing demographics. And I have a chapter in the book that's entitled "The End of the White Christian Strategy," right? That this idea of kind of we're going to pile up white Christian votes to compensate for the changing demographics of the country is an increasingly challenging strategy to pull off and win, as you can kind of see here. So where do we go? So in the book, I begin the book with an obituary, and I end the book with a eulogy for white Christian America. If you want to take a look at that, my attempt at doing that as kind of a metaphor. But it did occur to me that if we sort of accept the idea that this kind of cultural and institutional force that really was dominant in U.S. culture really has passed from the scene. Where do we go from here? And I sort of talk a lot in the book about, so where do people who are basically like celebrating and dancing on the grave of white Christian America, what do they do? Where do the people who are the descendants who are kind of grieving in various ways the loss of this presence in the country, where do they go? And one way to kind of see it, at least where people are, is we had this great question. This is one of those questions that we hatched actually here at the Brookings conference room. This question about, like, has the country changed for the better or changed for the worse since the 1950s, right? It turns out it's a question that divides the country almost evenly in half and then sorts people remarkably well and in kind of striking ways. So here's the question. Since the 1950s, do you think American culture and way of life has mostly changed for the better, or has it mostly changed for the worse? The groups are sorted here by descending order of people who say mostly changed for the better, right? So over here on the left, you see it's religiously unaffiliated people, African Americans, Democrats, Latino Catholics, African American Protestants, Hispanics as a whole, all in majority territory saying things have changed for the better since the 1950s. Down here on the other side is, all the way from the right, is white evangelical Protestants, the Tea Party, Republicans, white mainline Protestants here, so all at 4 and 10. But white evangelicals in particular, 27%, only 27% saying the country has changed for the better since the 1950s. And if you kind of look at the other side, you can see it like 7 and 10 white evangelical Protestants saying the country has changed for the worst since the 1950s. And I'll maybe end on this note of saying that, I think in this chart also is maybe one way of seeing some of the divides that we're going to be faced with in the election, right? That at the end of the day, this may be an election that is a referendum on the end of white Christian America and that vision of what the country was like, with groups kind of thinking back about kind of golden age of kind of white Protestant hegemony and power on the one hand versus kind of an America that looks very different from that picture I started with at the beginning of the presentation. So I'll stop there, and we can have a little conversation with EJ and Bill, and then we'll open it up.